Hello, my name is Kara Youngentob, and I'm going to tell you about some research that I undertook a few years ago that profoundly affected my understanding of how forest composition can influence habitat quality for leaf-eating animals and many other species. The research that I'm presenting here was supported by the New South Wales Government, the Australian Research Council, the National Environmental Research Programme, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, and the Australian National University. I'll start by providing a very brief overview of plant-animal interactions that are relevant to this work. Next, I'll talk about a project that our lab undertook to chart the quality of eucalypt foliage across forest and woodland landscapes in Eastern Australia. This project helped us understand relationships between the nutritional quality of landscapes and the presence and abundance of eucalypt leaf-eating animals. That project resulted in us looking at some landscapes more closely because of interesting patterns in animal species occurrence and tree species composition. This brings me to the Silvertop story. I'll tell you about how our findings added an important piece to the puzzle of why some eucalypt folivores were much less likely to occur in Silvertop-dominated forests. Subsequently, we've learned more about the ecology of Silvertop and how it is likely to be changing nutritional landscapes and what that means for eucalypt folivores and biodiversity more broadly. Lastly, I will acknowledge and thank our research team, lab, and our wide network of collaborators, without whom this research would not be possible. When I talk about nutritional ecology and plant-animal interactions, I like to start with a simple question. What do you see when you look at a forest? What I see, superficially at least, is a lot of green. That might not seem like a very profound statement, but it's actually quite remarkable when you think about everything that eats leaves. Why don't more landscapes look like this? Why don't animals simply eat themselves out of house and home? Sometimes this does happen, but generally forest canopies are green. The reason is that wild plants are actually very good at defending themselves from being overeaten. Over time, having evolved with animals as their predators, plants have developed a wide range of chemical and physical defenses. These defenses can poison animals or reduce the digestibility of key nutrients that animals need to reproduce and survive. There are whole fields of study dedicated to understanding plant chemical defenses and their effect on animals and plants themselves. Landscape scale variations in herbivore deterrent fuller chemicals and plant nutrients create a chemically complex environment that animals must contend with. When we talk about the nutritional quality of plant food, we're talking about both the good stuff, the nutrients, and the bad stuff, the herbivore deterrent compounds. You can't have a full picture of the system without both aspects. Nutritional quality, the good stuff and the bad stuff, can vary within and between plant species. It can be influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. That means you can have two plants of the same species that might have different chemotypes that make them quite different from a nutritional perspective. Alternatively, you can have two different eucalypt species that are actually quite similar in nutritional quality for a particular animal. This variation of fuller chemistry within and between plant species creates a patchy distribution of food quality and landscape heterogeneity that we can't usually see with the naked eye. However, research has demonstrated that variations in nutritional quality can impact how animals use a landscape and where they live. The nutritional quality of landscapes can influence animal reproductive success and population densities. That brings me to a project that our lab undertook a few years ago to look at how the nutritional quality of eucalypt foliage varied across much of the range of an iconic eucalypt folivore, the koala. Although the focus of this project was on koalas and koala habitat, the nutrients and secondary compounds that we measured are also important to varying degrees to other marsupial folivores like greater gliders and brushtail and ringtail possums. We worked with ecologists and koala researchers across Australia to sample leaves from areas with a range of different koala densities. Our sampling strategy was designed in consultation with accredited statistician, Associate Professor Robert Clark. We established 75 transects in 16 different areas, from Springshire in Queensland all the way south to Kangaroo Island and many places in between. At each site, we would collect leaf samples from 32 trees and also recorded other information about trees and site attributes. We sampled literally thousands of trees and every kind of forest and woodland landscape you can imagine, from swamps to semi-arid woodlands to tall eucalypt forests. Those leaf samples came back to our laboratory where they are freeze-dried and ground to powder. Then we conducted a series of wet chemical assays on a subset of the samples and developed models with spectroscopy to predict values in our remaining samples. We measured the good stuff, like available nitrogen, and the bad stuff, the secondary compounds that are known to deter feeding and marsupial folivores. I poached this figure from my student Jessie Au's PhD thesis. We found that there is a strong relationship between population densities of the koala and average site level available nitrogen. This graph shows the predicted mean density of koalas based on our data as the average amount of available nitrogen in a landscape increases. However, nitrogen, a key limiting nutrient for many eucalypt folivores, wasn't the whole picture. Formulated fluoroglucanol compounds, FPCs, are a class of plant secondary metabolites made by some of the koala's favorite eucalypts. In high enough concentrations, though, they deter feeding. You can see this effect in the green line on the graph. This line includes transects where the average concentration of FPCs was above the amount we expect to have a noticeable influence on food intake. Population densities at these sites were lower than what would have been expected if we were looking at available nitrogen alone. Notably, however, in landscapes with no FPCs, there tended to be very few koalas or no koalas. Those landscapes didn't have FPCs because they were dominated by a subgenre of eucalypts that didn't make FPCs. Those eucalypts are commonly called monoclypts and include your peppermints and stringy barks. Those trees make their own subgenre-specific secondary metabolite. However, we didn't know much about what those compounds might be at the time that we completed this study. Fortunately, my colleague Karen Marsh was making rapid progress on working that out. What we have known for a while is that subgenre-specific secondary compounds in eucalypts seem to be differently tolerated by different eucalypt folivores. Koalas, for instance, are pretty good at handling FPCs that are in many symphymertals. However, at sufficiently high concentrations of FPCs, koalas will stop browsing. Interestingly, at concentrations of FPCs that koalas can tolerate, animals like the ringtail possum won't eat the foliage. However, ringtails are clearly more tolerant of the secondary compounds in monoclypts than koalas. From field observations and a few feeding studies, we think that greater gliders might be somewhere in the middle, meaning they're generalists that frequently feed from both monoclypts and symphymertals, but also may be more sensitive to their secondary compounds than specialists like koala or the ringtail possum that primarily feed from one subgenre. Karen's work eventually revealed that monoclypts make a group of compounds called unsubstituted B-ring flavanones, or UBFs. Feeding studies suggested that these UBFs might be responsible for deterring herbivores from monoclypts in high enough concentrations. With this knowledge, we went back and analyzed our leaf data set for UBFs and looked at the relationship to koala densities. It looked like this. This is the log transformed koala density per hectare on the left, and you can see it declines as the average concentration of UBFs in a landscape increases from 0 to 40 milligrams per gram dry matter. Karen also undertook some feeding studies with captive koalas, and they were deterred from browsing by concentrations of UBFs that were much lower than their tolerance of FPCs, the secondary compound that symphymertals make. Karen's work on defensive compounds in monoclypts was timed well because we wanted to look more closely at something we learned while working on the south coast of New South Wales with Chris Allen and other local ecologists. Chris alerted us to the fact that koalas were unlikely to be found in forests where silvertop ash comprised the majority of trees in the landscape. Several different ecologists also told me that greater gliders seemed absent from these silvertop-dominated forests too. Silvertop ash is a monoclip that has a dark, persistent bark up the trunk that then peels away on the branches, giving it a characteristic silvery white top. It is an important timber species that is found across much of southeastern Australia, including the south coast of New South Wales and East Gippsland in Victoria. Jessie and I sampled silvertop and many other eucalypt species on the south coast. While I was there, I noticed a lot of even-age stands that were basically monocultures of silvertop with a bit of white stringy bark, also called globoidea, mixed in. Although I know that silvertop can exist naturally as a monoculture, the pattern of distribution that I observed were odd. For example, one side of a road would be a monoculture of silvertop, and the other side would be a mixed species forest. Something had happened on one side of the road that resulted in a lot more silvertop than the other. I later learned that silvertop ash is a disturbance-adapted species that seeds prolifically after fire. It also has a very resilient seed bank that can survive exposure and repeated drying, something that can happen when forest floors are disturbed from fire or logging. Silvertop ash is shade intolerant. It likes bright light where it will grow very fast and straight, and it has a slow rate of natural thinning. It also readily coppices. These characteristics help it to outcompete other species in disturbed landscapes. Chris Allen orchestrated a huge survey of koalas from Bermagui to Bega along the south coast of New South Wales. At every 500 meters, he and others searched 30 eucalyptus trees for koala scat and also recorded the tree species of each of those 30 trees and their point counts. We looked at that data and found that as the proportion of silvertop increased, indeed, the chance of koala scat being observed decreased significantly. When we looked at the nutritional quality of silvertop ash compared to other eucalypts that we sampled on the south coast, the reasons for the koala's absence started to become clear. Just in terms of the good stuff, available nitrogen, silvertop ash was lower in nutritional value than any of the other species in the area that we sampled. It should be noted that agglomerato was also pretty poor. In terms of UBFs, the herbivore deterrent compounds that the monoclips make, seabri was off the charts. Karen subsequently sampled Eucalyptus seabri from several other locations beyond the south coast, and so far, all of the areas that we've sampled have the same pattern of foliar chemistry, low nutrients, sky-high UBFs. There could be some chemotypes of this species out there that are different, but we haven't found them yet. I should say with this graph, the reason that UBFs are only shown the species on the left is because those are the monoclip species that make the UBFs. The species on the right are symphymertals, and they make FPCs, which aren't relevant here, so they're not included. We also looked at total nitrogen, which you can see on the top of this graph circled in red, because perhaps for species that were better with dealing with tannins, like ringtail possums, silvertop might be a bit better. Tannins bind to nitrogen and can make it unavailable for digestion, and it's considered in the integrated measure that we call available nitrogen that takes into consideration the effects of tannin binding on how much nitrogen is available for digestion. But some animals like ringtail possums can eke out nitrogen even in leaves that are well defended with tannins. So total nitrogen might be more relevant for some species like the ringtail. However, silvertop was still a standout as a very low quality food source. I think of ringtails as the goats of the marsupial folivores, and of all of them, they're probably the only one that can eat very much of this tree. I don't know why they put up with it, but maybe they deal with it because they don't have much competition. That's not to say that koalas and other eucalypt folivores never use silvertop for food or shelter. They might eat a little, and big trees certainly make nice places to rest, like this koala here is doing in the silvertop. However, this tree's nutritional value is so low that most eucalypt folivores, with the exception of possibly the ringtail possum, wouldn't be able to make this tree a substantial portion of their diet, if they can eat very much of it at all. We actually modeled what would happen to average available nitrogen in the South Coast forest as silvertop became more abundant. This doesn't consider the toxins, just a key limiting nutrient for these animals. Animals like the koala and the greater glider need on average about 1% polar nitrogen in their diet to meet their nitrogen balance. That doesn't mean they won't eat trees with less, just on balance, they have to have more. This graph shows what happens to available nitrogen in the South Coast forest landscape as silvertop increases. If you'd like to know more about how we made these models, you can refer to our paper, which I have listed up here. Although some individual trees in the landscape may still have the much needed higher nitrogen availability, overall, the number of those trees declines as silvertop increases until it becomes unlikely that these forests can support eucalypt folivores like koalas and greater gliders at all. This study demonstrates how nutrition can give us a sort of currency to rank habitat quality and understand why some areas support a lot more animals than others. Unfortunately, from everything we know about eucalypt nutrition right now, silvertop ash-dominated forests look like the one on the left. Low nutrients and a lot of toxins. Increasing silvertop dominance is also bad news for biodiversity more broadly. I don't know exactly how big this problem is, but I'm concerned it's actually quite large. Once I opened my eyes to silvertop and started seeing these forests for the trees in a way I never had before, I started to realize that there are large areas across the south coast of New South Wales and East Gippsland where this tree is so abundant. I started looking into the literature to understand whether it's always been that way, and I'm dismayed by what I'm reading. Things like this report from Crowther in 1946. There's a marked tendency for silvertop to invade areas which previously carried yellow stringy bark and other more valuable species. The original park-like stands of red ironbark and mahogany have now reverted to stands of young silvertop. Silvertop is a prolific cedar and very intolerant to shading. The silvertops grow more rapidly in the first few years than others, suppresses everything else, and as a result, a pure stand of silvertop seedlings takes possession of areas that were once a mixed stand of more tolerant stringy barks, mahogany, and red ironbark. Owing to the fast-growing properties and tendencies to more easy regeneration, it appears that silvertop and white stringy bark will form the major portion of future crop, and consideration should be given as to the methods of utilization of these species. And there's more. I won't read it all, but basically it says the same. I'm concerned that the landscape management practices, both in the past and still ongoing, are helping silvertop take over, and certainly are not doing anything to stop it. There's a lot of evidence that the increase in silvertop abundance reported from multiple sources is largely anthropogenic. I don't think there are ill intentions or any understanding of the cost to habitat for iconic species like koalas and greater gliders. However, now we know better, so we need to do better. We need to take steps to actively manage these forests in a way that helps them recover their nutritional value for threatened folivores and also restores their capacity to support a much larger diversity of flora and fauna. This tree, silvertop, which is already unquestionably more abundant in the landscape than it was before white people came to Australia, seeds prolifically after fire. There are multiple reports, studies, and accounts of this species' ability to literally take over after crown scorching fire. I published this nutritional ecology study on silvertop with my PhD student in October in 2019. 2 months later, this happened. All that silvertop that we know is out there will have dropped billions of seeds in this unprecedented fire event. Those seeds are now growing with these rains, and the fire was so severe that there is little shading left in a lot of those forests to stop them from becoming established. Our actions, both direct and indirect, are substantially diminishing the value of these landscapes. We need to change how we manage these forests. I firmly believe that we should be taking strides to actively suppress the proliferation of silvertop. Indeed, the response of silvertop to the 2019-2020 fires is already being reported. This excerpt from a report by the New South Wales government on the far south coast of New South Wales explains that massive post-fire germination of silvertop and casuarina is happening there. The concern about the shifts in these vegetation communities goes beyond habitat value to the potential consequences for ecosystems and how they respond to fire. I don't know how much research has been done in relation to that question, but I think it deserves closer attention as well. In summary, the nutritional quality of forests can impact the occurrence of folivores. Silvertop is not very good food for most eucalypt folivores. Landscape disturbance can increase the proportion of silvertop. These changes in forest composition are negatively impacting browse quality and habitat quality. Active management is necessary to reverse these changes. This work would not have been possible without the help of a huge number of people and organizations. I would especially like to thank the volunteers and people on the South Coast who helped us with our research there, including Chris Allen, Rod Peach, Rob Summers, Dean Turner, and Yuri Weidenhofer. Also, my amazing research assistant, Dr. Christina Zelenek, and now PhD graduate, Dr. Jessie Au, our lab, our administration, and all the people that help fund and support this research. And I look forward to continuing to work with many of you into the future. Thank you so much for listening.